After our planet had been bombed by those that had oppressed us before, we all took a little bit of solace as we all were still reeling from not only the incursion, the invasion, and the occupation that followed, but also from the fact that there were those who had come to save us. Angels had descended from on high to come and protect us, to save our species from complete annihilation. Not only that, but they had started to rebuild the infrastructure. They had also taken some of our old flora and fauna samples and started to clone them, create new ones, many different ones, so that now our planet would teem with life once again, though it would make many years before it would ever be fully covered in vegetation and animals like it was before, but it was still something that would bring us hope. But after the bombs fell, after so many had been lost, not only could we see images coming from their holographic displays of all the damage that was happening in the cities, but I watched as one of their shuttles came down. It seemed to be coming down without any problems at all, as many of the other ships moved out of the way. And to my horror, several of my kin, those that I barely remember because I was so young, were being brought back. But they were brought back in strange square boxes. 3 on each side was each of the humans as they carried them out in a rhythmic fashion that we did not fully understand at the time. But I knew what happened eventually. I saw the video. I saw what they did. And I saw that the humans not only had a sense of sadness in their eyes, a sense of loss, but behind that was unmistakable rage. An anger that could not be quelled was welling up inside them, and the longer it went without release, I could see that it was beginning to take them over. I asked once why the humans would actually declare war on our enemies if the enemies did not strike at their home world, if the enemies were simply fighting a battle that they wanted to retake their territory that the humans had taken before. This was not something to declare war over. Why would they risk their entire species for something like us? Our species is not as tall, as strong. Yes, we're bipedal. Yes, we have our 2 arms. Yes, we do look very similar to you. But why would you do this? I remember screaming this out, and one of these young soldiers, young relatively for humans that is, walked over, still with wet eyes, after he had placed that square box inside the dirt and covered it. He simply walked over and kneeled next to me and asked, "Was that your kin?" I said yes, it was, but I barely remember. He said it did not matter. We have a phrase back on Earth. He who shed his blood with me is now my brother. He shed his blood with us, and we will return that favor with our own blood, if that's what it takes. I didn't fully understand at the time, but I would grow to understand as I looked up into the sky that night and I saw dozens of human ships coming in. No, it wasn't dozens. It was several dozens. Hundreds were coming in. Was that thousands? What were those? Were those space stations that were moving? I could barely see. I asked one of the humans if they knew what was going on. They simply brought up one of their optics so I could see, and I looked up to see a massive armada of ships. All of them clearly of human design, but many of them had different markings on them. They had sometimes a strange red and blue marking on them, other times a green and purple. Some had just a solid stripe, others had words written on the side. Each one in almost a different language from the other and also a different way of being designed, yet they all were distinctly human. and the humans had come, and they were looking for a fight. With that, I saw many shuttles leave that night going back to the human fleet. Other ships came down, bringing more and more resources to us. And I watched as the ships, just as the sun began to rise the next day, jump out. After that, as we were in line for our food, I asked what would we be doing today. My angel looked over and simply stated, "Now you're going to start training." On board the ship Karachi, several soldiers were getting ready. They knew the first strike was always going to be easy. Well, easier in comparison. Humans had sent out a narrow beam transmission already to the home planets of each of the two forces, telling them that they have poked the bear. They kicked the hornet's nest. They have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and the humans are coming to pay them back. The humans, all of them, every clan, every tribe, every family, has sworn to defeat them at all costs. By our rules of war, human rules of war, you must declare it. You can't just blitzkrieg across. You must let them know. This is a simple courtesy so they can get their civilians out of the line of fire. And you could only hope that that's what they were going to do. But now, the soldiers made sure their weapons were ready, made sure their gear was ready, double, tripled, and quadruple checked everything, went through their drills over and over again as they could feel the lurch of the ships as they jumped from system to system. And they just waited for the signal to go. And they would not have to wait long. Jumping into the first system, every single human ship, without even a word's hesitation, as soon as they did, got locked on to the first enemy ship and began to fire. They fired until their weapon systems ran hot. They fired until their ordnance ran low. They fired until they were at point-blank range and made sure there was absolutely no way that any piece of space debris could get a single turret, a single piece of ordnance to fire. And then they aimed towards the surface. As they did, they launched pods and transports in massive numbers towards the planet. If the planet itself was not one that had a sustainable atmosphere, they simply would glass the planet, simply making it uninhabitable. But it is a very, very bad idea to make habitable, known as M-class planets, uninhabitable. And the humans would have a chance to vent their rage. And yes, we went down there and we wanted blood. Under all sorts of hail of aerospace fighters, ship-to-ground artillery was blasting it as the pods came down. I remember holding on to my pod. Here we come, here we go. There's the chute. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Ow, that hurt. Pops open and we're off. And we are blasting every single one of these bastards. Every single one that we see. It didn't matter if it raised its arm. It didn't matter if it ran away. We put ordnance right through it. Our armor-piercing incendiary rounds would go through lizard and insectoid alike without any hesitation. And we ripped through each of them. Whatever facilities we found that they had made, we simply torched. If we couldn't torch it, we blew it up. We went from room to room, ripping them up. They tried to bring some of those lasers, and yes, they did get a few of them up and running. I watched as several of my men got chopped. It was not fun to see. The laser would slice off a limb or right through the torso, but it ran so hot that it seared the wound closed. Without striking right next to the heart or into the head, we were alive. And our medical technology would take care of the wounded, though I doubt they're going to be interested in any type of anything besides some sort of painkiller at that point. But on through we went. When we ran out of ships to fire with, we used our guns. When we ran out of guns, we used knives, sticks, and bare hands if we had to, as we ripped into those that went after our friends. Within 4 days we had cleared the entire planet. 4 days the enemy had sent 2 different battle groups to fight us off, and our boys up there tore them a new asshole. On different planets, they would simply roll up. Those who wanted to be dropped to the surface would get in their pods and then hear, "Evacuate pods. No drop." As the ships simply glassed everything from orbit. The only bright spot that we had was every once in a while we would find 1 or 2 of the slave races, especially if we found a couple of our friends' species. We would grab them, though sometimes they would be kicking and screaming as they thought they were taken to be eaten or something like that. We had to use our translators constantly. Said, "No, we're bringing you home." They still screamed and yelled. One of our men, I watched as he carried this adolescent female, and she screamed and bit and everything, and finally he held her down, slapped her across the face, and she was just stunned. More stunned that she was still alive after being struck by a giant mechanical monster. But he then picked her up and ran back to the shuttle. I watched them go in and the ramp go up. She still was wide-eyed and confused, but I knew within several days she'd be back home. That was the only bright spot. The rest of the human fleet was doing what we do best. 2 weeks into the invasion, the human fleet has already taken over a dozen worlds. Many of the satellites, i.e. moons, are simply glassed. Their domes struck from orbit and the fleet moves on. No fuss, no muss. No time to give them even a chance to say, "Oh crap." It doesn't matter. The Insectoids would try to run at the fleets with insane amounts of numbers. Sometimes small snub fighters, only big enough for one Insectoid, couple of guns, and an engine. That's pretty much all it was. They weren't even expected to come back, as many of them would charge at the ships in orbit, firing their guns but not turn. They would keep firing and firing and firing until they crashed into the ships. At least they would try. Our point defense cannons and self-defense weapons were more than a match to keep most of them at bay. We did lose a couple of ships which had to go back for repairs, but aside from that, it was very one-sided. It was about this time that both sides, the Insectoids and the Reptilians, started sending transmissions telling us at first that we were nothing to them and they would soon fall to the might of their fleets. All that rhetoric of the rest of the universe is unclean, we must be the ones to control everything, yada yada yada. We've all heard it before. And that is what our generals told them. Well, that and get ready for a solid ass whooping. Our fleets did not stop. If anything, they simply grew in size as we spread across. More and more of the fleets from the home system came closer and closer to the front lines. Many of them, barely civilian ships, armed with point defense weapons, would simply bring supplies into the fleet itself, sometimes even in the middle of a firefight, and start offloading right then and there. Their point defense weapons just swinging left, right, up, down, as if left, right, and up and down is a thing in space. So much so, in a few cases, they had some incidents where the offloading drones would get knocked out because the point defense systems would be swinging one way or the other so much that the ship itself would roll or twist, bank, or in other way, shape, or form not be where it's supposed to be. Losing a couple of these drones was not much of a concern as we could build more of them. Yet it was still a concern that we needed the supplies. We burned through a lot of ordnance. Thank God for energy weapons. As the fleet continued its march, both sides that we were fighting against massed their fleets for one solid fight. Thankfully, by this point, we had deciphered everything in their ciphers. We know exactly where they're going to be. Hell, we even know how many ships there's going to be. So we simply brought ours together, and it was going to be one hell of a throwdown. Facing off with the lizards, there was no kamikazes. They didn't do that. But instead, as soon as the human fleets became into range coming out of FTL, they let loose with several of those distance lasers and start whipping through the air. The human fleets countered by sending up a sort of gravitational decoy. This would pull the laser sideways and make it bank off into, well, the middle of nowhere cubed. Then they would fire as well. They would fire not only decoys, not only some sort of gravimetric shell, but they would use massive coil guns to fire all sorts of ordnance clean through the ships. Normally, most ships would turn broadside so that they would bring the most guns to bear, but not human ships. They would simply charge at the enemy, firing all their weapons that they could, and if those weapons overheat, they would simply go adrift, flip, and use their aft-facing weapons to fire as well. And then when those got hot, they would flip again and continue to fire. If need be, they would simply drift themselves, turn themselves broadside, and then fire everything they had. It was an insane dance of ships, all remaining in formation as they flipped and burned and twisted and turned. It was absolute chaos as the screen showed, each of the ships tearing into their enemy with reckless abandonment. It got so desperate that the lizards actually decided to do something they were not even planning on doing. They charged the human ships, trying to ram into ours. Human ships may be high in number and they may hit hard, but the lizard ships, the carapace they were using was so much denser. And their ships, especially those from the home fleet, were much, much larger. It was like fighting several space stations at the same time, which is the reason why human ships fired so fast. They wanted to take down each of these, take them down as fast as possible. And unfortunately, as they got close, the humans began to take more and more casualties. For the first time in the entire war, both sides actually fought to a stalemate, as human fleets were desperately called in to try and turn the odds in their favor. It was not happening soon enough. Jumping several sectors takes hours, sometimes days to do so. Distance still equals time, even in space, and it was still insane. And eventually it was called the humans withdrew. Though the lizard fleet did in fact hold, what was left was barely a skeleton of what they had. When the human fleets reformed, they knew they could take the lizards and tear them a new one. On the Insectoid side, it was more one-sided. The human fleet could easily take down all the different types of Insectoid ships. They prioritized their numbers above everything else. You would think this would give all the machines a coronary or some sort of stroke, but no. Humans linked their machines together, and all the automated systems just started taking down all their different pieces of ordnance and all their different fighters coming in. The humans didn't seem to care much for fighters. Then again, fighters in space is a novel idea, but in practice is relatively stupid unless you're in an asteroid belt. And with that, the humans cut into the largest fleet the Insectoids had to offer, and instead of being fought to a stalemate, instead they brought up their main guns and fought right into the core and fired towards the largest ships possible. Insectoids are run by queens. This is a universal truth. It never changes, no matter which insectoid race you speak of. The humans seem to instinctively know this, and they fired directly into those ships with everything they had. Even if they were getting shot at from every single direction at the same time, they stayed on course, and they blew the large ships to pieces. And with that, the insectoid fleets went into complete disarray, seemingly not knowing which way to turn, left, right, or whatever. It didn't matter. Some simply spun in place, not knowing what to do, and leaving themselves open for the gunners and the automated systems of the human fleet to tear them apart. And with that, the last of the insectoid fleet was done. Now, it was on to their home planet. The lizards would have a slight reprieve, but not for very long. They simply tried to rally their fleet, get their damaged ships back up and running, but by the time they even formed halfway part of a battle line, the humans returned, and this time they were loaded for bear, or in this case, lizard. And as they jumped out of FTL, they fired with everything they had straight into the front lines. The lizards barely had time to react, as many of their ships were incredibly far out of position. They almost had to shoot through some of their ships just to hit the humans. The humans guided munitions team to bounce left and right, up and down, all around, as it would spiral around and then finally strike into one of the lizard ships, burying itself deep, aiming straight for the engine before exploding. Then the side would blow clean out of the lizard ship. Many times, you could actually see the explosions blowing out of one or two of the cargo holds, and then the ship would go dark, as the skin of the ship actually held, surprisingly, but the inside was a totally different matter. The humans were able to break the lizards, and many of them withdrew, leaving the planet below completely undefended. And with that, on both sides, the humans continued their march. As they did, on a lowly planet no one had heard of several months prior, young kids were getting ready. These kids that had watched their parents, their loved ones, be taken by those that wanted nothing more than to be superior, nothing more than to use them as cattle, as a food source, if they were lucky or not lucky, or use them as slaves for their own personal pleasure. Every time they thought about this, these kids, these young ones, even the young adults that were there, began to train even harder. They had difficulty using the human equipment as it was not designed for their smaller frame bodies, but they learned how. Very soon they would get their own equipment, made by their own people, in their own foundries. They would become ready. They would be able to defend themselves one day, even if that one day was not today. The war across the stars, because of so many worlds that needed to be taken down, took over 3 years. Human years, that is. And in those 3 years, the planet that had started it all was looking completely different. Foliage was now trees in large forests across the world. Their own native species of crops were growing, and their own native species of, animals were now plentiful. Plentiful enough that the natives could actually harvest what they needed without damaging their own ecosystem at all. They could be almost decadent in a way and still be able to survive on what was there. The humans, at this point, began to withdraw their numbers from the planet. Even though the young ones that were there did not want their angels to leave, the angels draped in white that had come to save them, what were they going to do without their angels? One of the young soldiers said it best. A young soldier that had once brought back one of his friends, his fallen brothers that had saved him and the rest of his men, said these words: "It's just time for us to leave. You can stand on your own now. And when you're ready, when all of you are ready, you can call us again and we will take you to the stars as well. As you can see, some of your number are already joining us. Some of your number will always be out there with us. But this is your planet, not ours." Humanity had already burned itself out of conquest at this point. The war itself was simply that of blind rage as it moved closer and closer to the home planet of each side, and eventually reaching down to their home planets. Both of them begged for forgiveness, begged to be saved, begged the humans not to destroy them, not to end their species. The humans simply waited with their fleets just outside of the atmosphere. The humans sat there ominously, contemplating whether or not to end these species from ever roaming across the galaxy again. Were they still a threat? Would they just pick up and start doing what they're doing again? Was this going to be enough? Would they have to end these species? The decision was a hard one to make for humans. Though there was the rage to follow, they still had the morality that they did not want to completely annihilate a species. So they decided with the middle ground. They sent several large wings of bombers down to their planets. Within several hours, many of the cities had been hit with something akin to a Moab, covered in white phosphorus and napalm. This was a warning, and they sent a message to each of their commanders, each of their leaders, the queens in the Insectoid race, the one that had buried herself almost past the mantle of their own planet to keep her safe, and also to the lizards, again run by an empress. They were warned. Remember this lesson, because if we ever have to come back, not a single one of you will ever survive. With that, the human fleets pulled back, knowing that it would take several decades for them to rebuild. Within that time, they should learn what it is to be subjugated themselves. They went back home. The humans flew past that one lone planet, that one seemingly backwater world in the ass end of nowhere. They seemed to sit in the sky as many of the young ones looked up and smiled. A human smile. It seems as though they had picked this up from the humans themselves. They looked up and realized that their angels would always be there to protect them. But then they looked down, and now they realized that they had their weapons. They had lost so much, but now they could look into the universe once again with hope, as their angels would protect them. Their angels that fought like demons against the monsters at the door. This would be a story passed down to each of their young, every single one of them. And as the young ones look up at their father, he looks at them all and say, yeah, that's when we knew they were going to be around for a long time. And if you want, kids, I'll take you to the human embassy tomorrow, and we'll talk with the humans themselves. Can we, Dad? Yep. Besides, I want to introduce you to an old friend.